It is now 7:35. We have a quorum, and so we're starting this meeting of the RTM F&B meeting. I want to go through the first things first. The first item on the agenda is to discuss and approve a special appropriation for $40,000 for an engineering study of the Norotan Heights Fire Department retaining wall. At last night's meeting at the Board of Finance, it was decided to take the $40,000 out of the capital reserve. That being said, I still want to have a conversation if anybody wants to discuss it. I can also say that personally, I think it was a good decision. This, whatever it will eventually cost, will come back to the RTM at some future date. The other thing is that I anticipate it'll come back. It may not. But the other thing is the Board of Finance also chose to take what was in the capital budget for this item and remove it from the capital budget for the fiscal 24. I think all of us who toured the fire department last year on a pretty cold day believes this is something that needs to be done. And so eventually we decided in the rules to use public health and safety and F&B just for the 40,000. When this comes up, should it come back to the RTM? And that was only because this is an engineering study, not the actual project. It'll be Public Works, Public Health and Safety, and us on this. So, are there any comments on that? I'm assuming we're all in favor of this 40,000. If not, speak now or forever hold your peace. All right, seeing none, we've discussed it. We can move on to the next. The next thing is discuss and approve special appropriation for $34,972 for dynamic speed signs. And it was in the Board of Selectmen package. The request for 4 signs were originally put in for ARPA funding. The funds were not allocated to this. The current places that it looks that these signs will be on are on Mansfield Avenue, which is a State Route 124 around Ox Ridge, and on Upper Holt Street, which is State Route 106. Those are the only 2 locations identified. So I'm assuming that they're going to be on both sides of the road. So people leaving and people coming. And so there's 2 locations that are there. There's about $2,000 from Public Works to install these. I'm assuming everyone has seen these signs that start saying you're doing 35 and you should be doing 25. Mm-hmm. We currently have them on the Boston Post Road near the library, near the Darien YMCA, at Tokenique Road near Tokenique School. Interesting enough, these are all state highways. And on Lower Hoyt Street near Holmes School, which is again State 106. So is there any discussion on this? Okay, so I need somebody to move this resolution. I have Charles moving it, Jenny second. Wait, I see Bill. Do you want to make a comment?
Nope. I'm good with it. Sounds good. A second.
Okay. Then let's take a vote. All in favor, say aye or raise their hand like like Bill had done previously. And oh, by the way, for the record, Bill is now formally on F&B. So that happened last night. So
Welcome.
congratulations, even though you were in.
Welcome. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so that passes. We'll report on that on the 17th. I was originally planning not to be here on the 17th and had requested that Bill report on the other item that we have. Unfortunately, Bill is not going to be here, so I'll be reporting on the one thing that I asked him to report on, which was the Little League stuff. So, but thank you, Bill, for going from there. Okay, so here's where we are right now. I'd like to discuss the budgets status that everybody had on their team. Discuss if you went on the school tour, discuss that because we really haven't had that conversation yet.
Jack?
And then
Sorry, you're off. Do you want to go to item 4, which is the architect study for police department locker? That's the next.
Oh, yes, sorry, I missed that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you, Jenny, for having one of us follow the agenda. This is another situation where, in fact, we don't have enough lockers in the women's locker room, and there's some special work that needs to be done because they have to be climate controlled and other things like that. And by July 1st, we're going to need to have those lockers because we will have 11 female individuals on our police force. This is to do the engineering study. What I've recalled that the actual cost will be someplace between 100 and 150,000. I've heard the number 125 being thrown around, but the Board of Finance, because it had to be done right away, decided to pay this out of the capital reserve. I have no problem with that either. So, that's good to go. I just wanted to give us an update. There is one thing that I did want to say, because if you look over how Chief Anderson and his administration has worked, and I said this in rules last night, we've added to the police force's diversity. Now, diversity isn't the intent because the chief and the administration will always look for the best qualified candidate and one that they believe will fit into our style of what they want to do for community service in the town. When Chief Anderson and I were exchanging some emails, I did mention that it's worthy to note and congratulate because even though he wasn't looking for diversity, the fact of the matter is to have the mindset that the best candidate could be a female or a person of color is what allowed for the diversity. And that's not always the case in many police forces. And so, I want to extend my thanks to Chief Anderson and his administration for having that mindset because I believe it creates a better community for us all. So that was my one point on that, even though it's already been paid for. Is there any other comments on that? But they want to have this done, and so it makes sense that the Board of Finance did exactly what they did. Okay, now to item 5. So let's talk about budgets. Board of Finance has been discussing the various budgets. Tomorrow night they'll be voting on the final budget. I'll give some discussion on the investment income. Jenny and I have had some conversations with Joan, and Joan and I have had multiple conversations over the last couple of weeks. So I'm not going to start with me. I'll start with Charles. Do you want to talk a little bit about the Public Works budget and the other ones you want?
Yeah, sure. I'm I'm happy to. So a number of us in the committee. So Bill, myself, uh, Mark, of course, who's no longer on our committee, but on Public Works Committee. You know, we all sent comments to Dave Martin, who passed them on to Jen, and she responded duly. I would say my take on the budget is that I think it's been extraordinarily well thought through and documented, and all the questions were answered in thoroughly in a lot of detail. There are some technicalities in these things around spending money and then applying for reimbursements from state grants later and these sorts of things. But in a nutshell, I have to say I thought it was very thorough and to the extent that there are cost increases, they're largely related to inflation and or costs that we don't control, like how much we get charged by Stanford for water treatment, for example. Um, and um, and anyway, I would suggest that I'm certainly happy. I would recommend that we basically wave it through as presented. There was a relatively small item, in fact, where they're proposing an additional, and I forget whether the term is parking marshal or parking ranger, um, where obviously the parking levels aren't quite back to the levels they were before COVID, and arguably they're not going to get back there. But they're saying that they would like to add an additional parking ranger to the tune of about $60,000, because at the moment they have a Department of Park and Works, or Public Works employees doing the work of the parking ranger they don't have. So there was a proposal to approve that. It kind of felt to me like a bit of a nice to have. So if I was going to push back on one thing, that would probably be it. But it's not a big amount of money. It's more just like the headcount philosophy. Do we want to constantly let headcount creep occur, basically? And I will say the other thing that I was pleased to see was that the department's looking for ways to pass on increased costs for everything from increased transfer station fees to haulers to possibly increasing parking fees, et cetera. So in a nutshell, I thought it was really well done, and aside from that small item, there wasn't anything that I would have raised for discussion.
Are there any questions for Charles on this budget item? Charles, was your main one, or did you have another one there as well?
So
I mean,
in my review, I should say in my review covered basically there were 5 budgets. There was parking comes in 2 flavors: operations and the fund and the investment fund. The same is true for sewers, and then it also includes the headcount and the out-of-pocket expense for the Parks and Recs department. So the stuff that we as a group, Bill and I and others looked at, was all five buckets.
Gotcha. Bill, do you have something to add?
No, actually, I'm deferring to Charles, and I appreciate it. It all looked pretty good to me, just as I'm getting up to speed on this.
Okay.
Good.
All right. So that's one. Jenny and Barry, do you want to talk about Park and Rec? Well, how about you talk about Park and Rec as opposed to giving you an option?
So I didn't get a chance. I know the Board of Finance talked about Parks and Rec last night, but I haven't had a chance to my knowledge, I don't think there was any outstanding issues. Certainly on Barry and I talked about if we saw anything, we were pretty happy with where the budget came in. They were pretty close to guidance coming in to the Board of Finance, and largely thanks to the ARPA money that was used to kind of speed up spending on capital items. Their capital requests I thought were pretty well, including the aerator. So yeah, the only thing that I think is interesting, and it's certainly not for this budget season, but they did share, Adele Conniff did share with me when we had requested a couple months ago, the credit card processing fees. We did get that information, and that is, there's certainly something to look at there in terms of the amount of credit card merchant processing fees that Parks and Rec alone is generating, and are there ways to? I'm sure they're paying almost 5.3% in total fees on $2.3 million of revenue last year, which is that's a pretty big number. It's $125,000 in fees. How that gets reduced remains to be seen, and I'm sure the IT committee is looking at it. And so now that the awareness has been raised, I'm sure it'll be part of the.
It's not, but
It will. Yes, it will. And as
well,
far as
I'm going to speak to John because I'm not sure it is. So I'll speak to Jay-Z.
that it's not being looked at. I think, well, the IT committee is theoretically looking at it. So,
Okay.
but now that we know that there might be some money there, we can keep talking about it.
5% is a very high interchange fee.
That's very high. Well, yeah, it's right.
Having come from that industry a part of my career, that's a very high interchange
Very
charge.
high. So other than that, Barry, I mean, I'm trying to think of, there's no outstanding issues that I had. I know we did get an update from Pam Geary on the status update on where all the projects that were funded for capital are on target. I know they just finished the Cherry Lawn gazebo. The new ADA ramp is installed. It looks great. Other projects I know the playground committees are all in process. So things are moving along well. So I don't know, Barry, is there anything else that I left out?
I thought they were really on top of it. I thought it was well managed. I had no problems that I could see.
I'll also add that if some of you recall, when I asked for the financials associated with the bathrooms in
Pear Tree.
Thank you, Pear Tree. It stinks getting old sometimes. And when I asked for it, Monica looked at me during the meeting and said, Jack, you're not going to be happy with them. And so I know with some work from Jenny and from Adele and even Pam, they all three of you knew that I thought the bathrooms had to be done. The problem is that there was a cap on what we could invest in there without having to put the place on stilts. They did come back with a better estimate. It's not perfect.
It's about 51,000, right?
Yeah, 51, 52. It's a little more than what they came in, but that's still good. And I don't know what contingency wasn't put in there, which I always feel a wee bit happier, or maybe it was for a couple grand. But I do want to report that they did come back with a better capital analysis so that we know exactly what's going to be done. And again, I was supportive of it before, just wanted to make sure that the details were there to support what was going on. And they delivered, Pam delivered. So I'm very happy with that. So that's my only addition to that.
Can I ask quickly, what was the limit on the bathroom? Like was it like 58,000?
I think it was I can't say if it was 58, but I knew I was using the number 60 based upon a conversation with Kate. So when they're coming in at 50 and it was undefined of exactly what they were doing and what the costs were for what they were doing, I was a little bit concerned because, good intention didn't need to cost us a much larger amount because we then were forced to raise the building. So, and I know that Jen and Kate are watching it like a hawk. So, because that was also their concern. So, But yeah, I think whether or not it's 58 or 60, I was always using 60 as the number that they couldn't go over. So, any other questions? Okay, we're going to go to Malin. You had a whole bunch of stuff.
I did. Some of mine are easy though. So I had, if we start with human services, that was a pretty short conversation at the Board of Finance, and it's no change in headcount and very little shifting and very little additional money. So that budget just kind of sailed through. Health department has another sanitarian added. That is the person that is needed to inspect nail salons and some of the other establishments that have to get inspected from the health department by law. So that's the addition to that budget. And so those were the kind of the quick ones. I also had the police, and there's a few changes in their budget. They are adding one police officer. They asked for two. They got one, and it was deferred until January. So they're basically adding a half this year. And let's see what else. And they are spending some money to upgrade their computer-aided dispatch system, which sounds like it really, really needs to be done. And then there's additional monies because of the contract that was recently negotiated. And so there's money that comes into this budget for that reason. The additional FTE is, we had an extremely well thought out discussion at the police department with a variety of stakeholders, and it was a very robust discussion, and the police are making just a very strong argument for adding another sworn officer. And just one example is just looking at body cam footage and how long it takes. And you can't always have civilians do this. Sometimes you have to have a sworn officer do this. So I just think their budget is well thought out and should be supported. And then I also had fire. I did go to the meeting last night, and then the executive session lasted so long that I gave up and I left. And so I have not listened to it yet. So I'll talk about fire and fire marshal next time. But I don't see any big problems in those budgets. I did hear the discussion at the Board of Selectmen, and I had discussions with some of our Board of Finance counterparts about the fire and fire marshal budgets. And it seems like that it's probably time to add some of the personnel that are added into this management structure, like getting a full-time fire marshal, getting a full-time emergency emergency management director. It's just with all the stuff going on in town, with all the requirements that they have to inspect any multifamily home, any multifamily unit, it just seems like that now is probably the right time to do all of this. And I hope that we'll find some efficiencies if we can manage the fire departments a little bit tighter. And I think you kind of have to have the management structure in place to do that. So I guess that's it for where I am. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
I just want to add a couple of things here. I'm going to say it was maybe even 4 or 5 years ago. When we were bringing in the civilian dispatch, even though I know the union contract requires a certain number of officers on every shift, one of the things that Jamie was pretty insistent on is making sure that we finally had a narcotics officer, and we've also been down a traffic officer. And I will say, for at least the first day of April, we were fully staffed finally in the police department. department officers. However, they already knew that somebody was retiring. Um, but yes, these are things that were promised and were decided a long time ago that we needed that traffic officer and we needed that narcotics person as well. I can also say during the planning, zoning, and housing meeting when Jeremy was there, because he's dealing with the zoning and the applications for coming on. He did say that, when he's looking at a house that's putting in, 27 burner Wolf stove, he's really amazed sometimes because he mentioned there are 50 eateries in the town of Darien, which really had me a little gobsmacked. But between the coffee places, the delis, the restaurants, and all the other things that are coming in or are planning to come in at the three developments, that's quite a lot for this town, and it would require that. So we already knew that somebody was coming on for the health department to help do the inspections and other things that had to be done, not only at the eateries, the nail salons, and all the other things that they get involved with in multifamily housing. Last year, in the budget, we added one additional fire inspector, but it was agreed last year's budget that the second fire inspector that was requested last year would be added this July 1st. So the addition of the fire inspector, marshal, whatever we want to call him, her, whatever, is consistent with what was discussed in last year's budget, and with the new housing coming on and the required annual inspections of all these units, as well as the progress that these homes have made, it made sense. That's at least my perspective. Bill, you have a question?
I think that hand was raised a while ago. So,
Oh, all right.
and by the way, there'll now be two deputy fire marshals and two part-time fire marshals and deputy fire marshals. So two full-time, two part-time. And the expectation is that next year one of the part-times will go to full-time, and that the next year you'll probably have yet another part-time go to full-time. So I think this is just the price of growth, that you have to get your infrastructure in place to accommodate it. I have one comment, and it's really not the right time, I think, to discuss this in the budget, but I did read the consultant's report about the emergency management systems that we have in town, and it does flag the fact that according to this consultant, the best dispatch that you can use is a regional dispatch system for your police. We use that for fire and EMS, but we use the civilian dispatchers for the police. And it would be really shifting gears, and I don't have all the data to say that they shouldn't be doing civilian dispatchers. They should be farming it out, but I don't think anyone has asked 9 civilian dispatchers versus the cost of, like, what are you, how do you compare these two different approaches? So that's the only other, but it's not the right time to discuss it. This is the budget, and they've been going down this time for a long time. So I don't think it's fair to ask for a shift of gears right now. And they certainly need more sworn officers, for sure.
So I do know that out of that emergency management study, I think Kate mentioned it during the presentation of the budget to the Board of Selectmen, that the emergency management study did suggest that somebody go in there to help the fire departments, because these are volunteers and we're asking a lot of people, and some people are better at finances than others. Some people are better of recording what training went on than others. and it just depends upon who's in there, and it can change from area to area. And I'm not saying anything's wrong. They would know if it is. I have no knowledge on that. But so that position was based upon the emergency management. I know there's been conversations on the civilian dispatch on it, and we have a good crew. And while we're short, the people who are there volunteered to work longer hours to cover us so that police officers don't have to go in. And yeah, they're making some overtime in that, but I there's certain lanes. While it might be a good conversation, there's certain lanes I don't like getting into,
Yeah, I agree. That's
and and this isn't our lane. When you
yeah.
come back and tell us what you want to do, we can re-enter the lane. But in this particular case, you know,
I
I got
agree with you.
enough.
I
I have
agree with
enough
you.
scars of what's going on. I don't need to
Right.
address that one.
Right.
So yes, but I do agree that it's something that's been up, and it's actually an interesting read. The survey that they did, and again, you would have greater insight. So eventually, Melinda, since you've mentioned this, I think it's actually worthwhile that one of our meetings after budget might involve Kate and yourself, because I know you have expertise in this beyond post, honestly. Um, and based upon your career background, that it would be an interesting conversation to discuss what's in there and what's not.
Mhm.
So, I think Kate can do some of it. We could possibly have a session, because if anybody hasn't met Bob Bush, you're meeting somebody who is definitely worth knowing in town. Um, he's good at what he does. He has a great sense of humor, and he knows this stuff fairly well. So it would be a fun meeting. So, um, anybody else have anything on those three topics? Oh, I will also say that the human services, the head of human services, really does a great job. We're very lucky to have her. She's from town, but I think we're lucky to have her based upon my prior conversations with her. Okay, what's up next? Oh, we did that. We did public works. Um, Bert, do you want to talk about some of the areas? I believe you had general government and a couple of others.
Yes, I think we need to talk about that. That's there are a few items in there thrown together, and most of them fall under the finance director's budget. But the largest, of course, is in that budget. The question, how much money we're gonna earn on the town's investment portfolio. And so we had a great meeting between John Walcott and Taylor Carter from the Board of Finance, and Bill Smith and myself. So I think since Bill Smith is new, Bill, why don't you start? Tell us, what did you think about the meeting?
You mean Bill Dunn or Bill Smith?
Bill Smith.
Oh, okay.
The meeting went well, and I think you're right, Bert, that the key focus was on the investment return of the monies being held by the treasurer.
Yeah, I think, first of all, the structure we're having in place for the legislature and the executive branch to meet and talk about the budget is great. I think Jack started it. He used to call it the buddy system. I don't think we call it the buddy system anymore, but it works because these are people who have similar backgrounds and similar interests in promoting the budget, and it works very well. Especially, it works well when there are difficult questions coming up, and none is more difficult, in my view, than the investment income from the town's investment portfolio. It's second only to what has to be considered for funding, for bond issuance, for capital issuance, with different interest rates moving. Because anything else we discuss is under our control, more or less, but the interest rate environment is not under our control. There's only one other area in the town budget and under public works, which would be the snowplow expenditure. That is less, that is just about as volatile as interest rates, because we don't know it's going to snow, and we don't know if interest rates are going up or down. So I think we had a good conversation, and in the end, it's really a good approach to slice and dice the issue and see what for every month of the budget we expect funds to be available for investments, and what do we expect for interest rates to be at that time. Since we don't know where interest rates are going to be, it still doesn't help us a whole lot to slice and dice it into 1 month's expectations, but it does help us to understand in the future, when what we expected doesn't happen, where we went wrong, or where we thought rates would be up or rates would be down. And you think this is all going on too long from my side, but if things work well, or if things work as well as they expected in the budget right now, interest income for the town will be $1.5 million. If they work better, and I actually think they will be, it might be as much as 3 million. And if they don't work as well, it may be down to 1 million. And you put that number in the budget, it's very difficult, because it may or may not happen. So we discussed this with John Walcott and Taylor Carter from the Board of Finance, and Bill Smith and I, and we all agreed it's a difficult year. The Federal Reserve has been behind, and now they're still behind. They were behind in raising rates when inflation kicked in, and they, I believe, will be behind in lowering rates when the recession starts. So the only way you can deal with it is saying, and most people would agree, interest rates will stay where they are, or maybe go up another 0.25%, and at some time they will come down rapidly when we have inflation, but we don't know when. And the fiscal year for the town of Darien is between July 1 and June 30th, 2020, for the fiscal year 2024, between July 1, 2023, and June 30th, 2024. So when will the Fed raise the rates more? Maybe early. When will they lower the rates dramatically? Sometime during the fiscal year. We're locked into a 12-month period, and we don't know what's going to happen. Even if you assume the Fed's going to lower rates dramatically, if they do, and it's going to be in January, it's a different ballgame than if it happens in October or if it happens in May. And that will affect a big amount of money in the budget. So I think we need to keep working on that, and I think the Board of Finance is working on that, because that creates a lot of volatility in the budget, how you account for that. And I think it's a different budget item than other operational accounts, because it's so much dependent on what's happening in the outside world. The rest of the discussions focused on the other items in the general accounts in the finance department budget, but they all dwarfed by the big number that evolves from the investment accounts. So that was a good discussion we had. I can accept the $1.5 million that is penciled in right now for the investment income. I think it's better substantiated than last year when we started in the budget with 77,000 and are likely to end with something of $1.5 million, not to the fault of the planning or the budgeting or the treasurer. It's just how volatile the market is. And so that's something I think, need to have a better eye on in the future. We all have an eye on the funding requirements on issuing bonds, but our investment portfolio is so large now, and the interest rates in the country are so high that our focus needs to be more on this aspect. That's what I have to say. Please ask
Okay.
me any questions.
I'm actually going to add some information. Joan and I are actually speaking almost weekly, at least knowing what's going on in the portfolio and the rationale for it. So one of the things that I was happy to see is that the town is now about 30% in stiff. Earlier in the prior years, and Bert did some analysis on this, stiff wasn't earning that much anyway. During the time when the Fed was at zero, nobody was earning anything, but we're now at about 30%. We have about 24 mil in we have 24 mil in treasuries. You know, this isn't a political statement. This is just an honest one. For years, Joan wanted to go into treasuries, and everybody said, oh, you should do treasuries, but nobody did anything about it. And Wayne had some legal concerns of what was going on, and nobody pressed him on it. Monica came in, and she pressed, and we got Wayne to be comfortable, or she got Wayne, and Jen, and Joan got Wayne to be comfortable with going to Chase and having them being the holder of our of the T-bills for us. So, you know, when I'm giving credit to Monica, it's not a political statement. It's that the logjam that had been there for a long time was never broken up until Monica stepped in and said, I'm going to do something about it. So we now have 24 million. We're doing typically 3 to 6 months. Part of that is because we have to manage to our liquidity. You know, even though we can invest that money, quite honestly, we have to spend that money also. And people forget in June, the teachers still have an option to take all of their summer pay in one lump sum in June. So we have to make sure we have the monies for that, for other projects that are going on. And so Joan is working very closely with Jen and with Monica to determine what our cash flow needs are. And Jen and Joan are working very closely together also in measuring what we can and can't do. So I think that's a great improvement of what's going on. Also for the townwide, not talking from an accounting perspective, but town accounting, we don't record the revenue from a treasury until it matures. So if we're doing a T-bill and it's maturing in July, none of that income is being allocated on a month-to-month basis for, let's just say, 3 months for May and June. Or maybe April, May, and June, depending upon when we purchase it, until it comes mature in July. Joan and Jen, last year, Joan wanted to recast and was told not to. Basically, that's my understanding. So Joan, with the changes in the interest rates, knew that 75,000 was not going to be the number. But was not allowed to do so. But Jen and Joan took separate paths on how to recast the 1.4 that was in the budget, and they both came up approximately at 1.6. It's my understanding that it was put forward that the portfolio could earn 2.2 million plus change, and I believe that Jen told the chair of the Board of Finance that is not a possibility. So we're also very cautious of, and I know there's been some concerns about regional banks, we're also very cautious of where we put the unused proceeds from our bonds, and they go into Chase because that's a bank too big to fail. And while they're too big to fail, they also pay bupkis on what we deposit there. So while we do have issued funds coming in until we use it, it sounds, oh, we should make a lot of money on it. It's where it is that we're not going to. And it's part of it of where we invest in regional banks, what treasuries expect to be there. And the very small ones are limited to 250,000 anyway. So anyway, Jen and Joan came in with a number of 1.6 million, which they, as I said, came in from different perspectives. They're comfortable with that. There are some things that might not have been included in the initial calculation because HHR debt wasn't defined. Joan really couldn't figure out how to invest those funds or when the cash flow was. I don't know if they were in the next round of calculations. We didn't get into that depth. During the meeting last night, somebody then suggested that our earnings should be 1.9, and I think somebody came up with, why don't we use 1.7 or 1.75, someplace in the middle between the two. And, look, I always like to have more money in the budget, because I think we underestimate revenue far too often. But as Bert said, if you could believe what Powell said, which is a coin toss right now, since he went to all local treasurers of those banks and said he wasn't going above 2%, and then went to 4% and more than that. Powell said he's not going to decrease rates in the current calendar year. So one would not expect a decrease regardless of a recession happening or not. This is his public statements, his testimony to Congress. And so you got to at least say that's what came out of the horse's mouth. Whether or not we reduce rates in the second half of the year, which could in fact lower any of the interest income that we're making, if you really know the answer to that, please let me know, because there's a lot of things I'd like to hedge on that. But we can't. And Louisa, I see you're shaking, and I know this is stuff you followed. Do you want to add anything to what I just said?
Yeah, I think that they still have the goal to bring inflation to 2%. So
Right.
it is very sticky, the inflation right now. And I don't think they should move that target that they have. So it's going to be very difficult to see a to see them decreasing rates unless they really get closer to inflation. So I just don't see it. What you are going to see is a natural break on consumer spending because of the increased interest rates and the cheap money is gone. So I think that again, it's just more the consumption that will restrain, and what you will see is you see again, it is just the change of if we come into a recession, it just will affect more just the long dated rates, but I just don't see happening a cut.
Which is why keeping short term in our investments makes a lot of sense. But
Completely, yeah.
I also read this week, I believe, that job openings is down to 10 million for the first time in 2 years. And I believe Friday the employment numbers come out. So that's, when you start hitting that, a lot of firms are doing layoffs and other things. In the tech area, I do know from speaking to some people that are involved that there's a lot of smaller companies that are scooping up these people real quick. You just may not get the same benefits and perks that you got in the larger companies, the big fortune. But on the other hand, there's also been certain traffic out there with several of the people that have been left go on the West Coast or in Austin, where they're all getting together. And so I tend to believe of what happened previously in these type of things. You get a lot of people that get real creative and they may have been working on some things in their big firm and now they can really go without having some middle management tell them you can't do this anymore. So I think that we might see a lot of new startups at the same time, which is always great for this country when that occurs. But yeah, so I think I'm not sure where they're going to end up, but I know that the number that Bert was referring to, the 1.5, has moved up to 1.6. So, and I'll try and keep everyone, advised of what I'm getting from Joan. I think that we can see the investment structure and how she's dealing. She's been in constant contact with Monica on regional banks and risks and other things like that. And in conversation, Joan and I have experienced similar things in bank failures and that, and what the ratios are. So I think we're in sync on that. But she's doing counsel to Monica on how to reduce risk in those areas.
I really appreciate what Louisa was saying and you, Jack. I think it's great. Okay, we're having a conversation of on the economy at large, which shows how things have changed. In the past, it was not an item on FNB's agenda or for the Board of Finance. It has become a very important consideration for towns like ours. And I think it's great that we deal with it. The taxpayers in Darien who listen to this need to understand that we're not parochial. We really understand what's going on around us. And I don't care if the investment income is budgeted at 1.5 or 1.6. And if we have 30 or 40% in stiff, I actually think it should be 80%. And we would make more money. But we're having these discussions for the benefit of the town, and we're not insensitive to what's going on around us. It's happening to everyone. Every family in this town is affected by inflation, and everyone is affected by how this budget is going to work. And so I think it's great people like you guys thinking about it and coming up with some ideas how we can deal with everything. It's a very long process, and I think it's great how people are dealing with it. Thank you.
One other thing I will say, we're going to end up with $1 million extra in revenue for what was budgeted for investment income versus what it's actually going to come in at. And I'm just using $1 million right now. I tend to believe that at the end of June, it may be higher than that, but I'm not going to guess anything over that. So we're going to have $1 million there. If we record $1.6 million, which is where Jen and Joan came out, that's approximately 2.6 million. The extra million's going into the general fund, which allows us to pay down capital. All right. So that reduces the budget because we have that extra money. The 1.4 versus 75,000 goes into revenue. So when we take what we're going to spend less revenue, that's giving us a significant reduction to our budget. Plus, if you go to the fact that the grand list once again grew by a large amount, and if we apply the current year's mill rate to that growth in the grand list, that potentially gives us another 2 million over there. So while I can't say we're overly happy with some of the increases in the Board of Selectmen budget as a percentage wise, to achieve what I think we can achieve in the increase in the mill rate, depending upon what's bonded, what we're paying out of the general fund because of funds that were recorded, what we're getting simply because the grand list has grown, what we're getting because there's a significant growth in the investment income, could very well mean that while we have some of these expenses, that our mill rate will not grow. We'll find out tomorrow, as much as some of these expenses say. But then it's something that Charles mentioned that I think is also important. Number one, just because we got $2 million extra in the growth in the grand list because of the developments doesn't mean we should be spending it. All right. And building up things that we're going to have to carry forward. Also, just because we have these extra funds that are reducing the growth in the mill rate, we should still be concerned when we're seeing growth in expenses above the guidance that was sent. Again, 3.5, which the Board of Ed got to. But we should be concerned because that's the creep that Charles was talking about, very much so. And I think he raises a very valid point, and a point that we within this committee should be dealing with. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Charles, but.
No, Jack. I think you've you restated my point quite accurately.
Okay. And by the way, I share his point.
For what it's worth, as far as interest income is concerned, like my own opinion is, even the smartest hedge funds in the world don't always get it right. So I think rather than engaging in a fancy, prognostication exercise, I think it would be wise for us to assume a conservative amount of money, not 1.5 or 1.6, but I don't know, 1.2. I mean, you could debate what the number would be, yeah. And then anything above that, we put into a slush fund, right? And we save it for, other areas where we maybe aren't so lucky, right? And we get a big snowfall next year, or a bridge that decays that we didn't think was going to decay, whatever it is. So.
Yeah, oh, you mean like what we already have had experienced in the town? I'm going to mention something else as we're talking about budget, but Ralph Olden, who has been following sewers for us, and you might want to expound on this a little bit more, Jenny, because you were up there. I passed on his email to the Board of Selectmen. We did 3 studies on drainage. 2 of them are complete. The last one is having its final analysis. But I believe we put like 1 million or maybe 1 million plus change into the budget for the one that hasn't been finalized. And the estimates to fix this is coming back at about 6 million. And I know that Kate has had conversation in board meetings and between myself and her that, you know, the ARPA money we have there, where we may need to relook at ARPA or do an ARPA bonding combination to address some of those sewage issues that we thought were going to come in at one price and it's not coming in there. So, and just a reminder, everything in ARPA was separated and listed specifically. So it's not, and there was some contingency there, but it's not as if they can move one to the other without going through approval of the Board of Selectmen, the Board of Finance, and the RTM. So if we're not going to use $1 million on that, we want to move it to another sewer, even though they were both sewer projects. This is not the Great Island. It all has to go back through that process. So I just want to remind people. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Jenny?
No, that's it. It's that I don't know why the number got so much bigger, but it will come back to us.
Right. And the other thing is that Ralph is requesting that for at least the two that are done, that the Board of Selectmen make those studies public so that we can start looking at them and gearing up to build consensus or ask questions or other things like that before it comes down the line. Okay. We're now at, I do want to say, Bert, can I ask another question? And Beth, you too? I'm assuming you guys went on the school tour of the
Yes,
facilities. Do you have any comments on that we should be aware of or anything else going on?
ladies first.
Well, I think I was on the tour with
Oh, okay, you were?
with Bert.
That's good.
I don't really have any comments other than, you know, generally the capital infrastructure of the school system is well taken care of. They've done continue to do a good job. I admit I did duck out before everybody went to Ox Ridge because I think there's a very good handle on what's going on in Ox Ridge, and I had a conflict. I didn't think we needed to be there for that. But you know, the review of the 3 elementary schools being renovated. I don't think there's anyone there that had any questions about the merits of what needed to be renovated and what the proposals were. And I believe, if I'm correct, I believe there is a excuse me, I believe there's a significant information on the Board of Education website if people want to go ahead and dig into it.
What about Fitch? What did you have an opportunity to go there?
Yeah, I was at Fitch, and you know, again, it's a successful program, and my recollection is that, and I don't remember the numbers and the percentages, but they want to expand the footprint of the operation by a material amount, and I think we have every expectation that that is money well spent and is going to help the program succeed.
Bert, do you have anything to add? And I'm sorry, I said Beth, but I knew Peter, you went, and Beth was unable to go on that day. So I apologize to
So
Beth.
it was really, it's always an eye-opening experience. I mean, our school system is second to none. I talked to Dr. Adley and I said, when I went to grade school, we had 2 classrooms for 4 grades. So for first and second grade, you were in the same classroom. Okay. Now you're suddenly at Oxford. I mean, words cannot describe. I felt I was in heaven. Okay. Compared where I was when I was 7 or 8 years old. I don't think it did me any harm because when you're in first grade and you have only one classroom, you just attend instructions with the second graders. But having said that, it's a great concept. It will, from a financial standpoint, since we're FNB and are supposed to protect the taxpayer, it will come back in when you sell your house. And in the meantime, it will come back in what your children's education is like. Is the library bigger than I could have ever imagined it at Oxford? It's huge, okay? The music room. I mean, you're in a concert hall. Yes, we have spent a lot of money, but I'm okay with it. And I'm a conservative. I'm okay with it. Thank you.
So,
I
by the way,
want
for
to
information,
add, if I may, one of the things, and I'm absolutely actually embarrassed. I can't remember the gentleman's name who was the chief engineer for the schools before he retired last year. But one of the
Mike
reasons why
Lynch.
Mike, I mean, he was a genius in terms of keeping things running, finding parts for, and I'm just but trying to remember some of the details, but parts for heating systems that go back to the 40s, and he kept all of that running, and his successor continues to kind of follow up with that. And I think one of the best things about the renovation program is a lot of those systems which are out of date, not just it's not just a code issue, but literally mechanically out of date, are being replaced, and I think that's going to inure to the town's long-term benefit.
So I did want to add something before I ask Barry if he has anything to add. When Bert talks about being, in first and second grade together, I want you to think of, instead of Little House on the Prairie, Little House in the Hinterlands. So that's my one comment on that.
And I apologize for forgetting that Barry was there.
Yes, I didn't. So Barry, is there
Yes.
anything else that you want to add?
Yes, I was on the school tour, and I thought they did a great job. I thought everything seemed very appropriate. The schools look great. I was very impressed with what they're doing with Ox Ridge, where all of my three kids started. And I have 5 grandchildren that are going to be going through Tokenique, so I guess they're not going to be affected by any of that capital. But no, I was fine with it.
Yeah. And by the way, I just want to remind people, and I don't mean to embarrass Barry at all, but people should remember, and that's why I'm very curious. I was happy that Barry wanted to go on the tour. Barry was on the Board of Ed of our town for 1 or 2 terms, maybe more. But I
Early
think
90s.
that's. I'm sorry.
Early 90s.
Yeah, but I think that's worthwhile because he brings a whole different perspective when he's going and touring these schools and going back to them, and he does have that knowledge because while we say things, there isn't a heck of a lot that's changed in how things should run in a school system. We may have some new courses, we may have some other things. We have a new track and a football field that's blue, but other than that, the basic concepts of how this works, Barry's very familiar with, and people shouldn't forget that he's previously served in that capacity because I think it adds some additional information to us. And before we go on to Great Island, Peter and Beth, do you want to give your concept of the Board of Ed budget? Somebody has to unmute.
Forgive me, sorry. At this point, I really don't have any updates. We know that there's been some discussion of changing process, and I am not, regrettably, not prepared to discuss those things due to being out of the country for a week and then sick for a week. I still have to catch up on that.
Yeah, I would like people to look at the meeting that was held for the finance department by John Cini. I can send out the links again, as well as the Board of Ed meeting. I do believe there needs to be some changes in the budget area, but I think there's been some misstatements because, quite honestly, F&B, we really don't see Adley or Duke here often. And when we do, it's typically because there's a union contract here, or we might ask them for the budget, but you know, we're not telling them. And they ask, should they come for certain things? And I basically said, no, you've given us all the information. You discussed it at the board meeting. We have people that's followed it. No, if we have a problem, I'll text you during the meeting. Otherwise, stay home and enjoy yourself. So yes, Beth, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think if anybody hasn't seen, I wish I remembered the date now, the Board of Ed meeting, where at the end, Duke and John, to some extent, discussed the process and how they think it needs to be altered. I think it would be worth just seeing that snip. You don't need to see the whole meeting. It's probably 10 minutes at the end, but it's worth watching. I can research and come up with which one it is and then send it out.
There's a meeting, I believe, on April 27th with they want to have a further discussion. I don't recall if it's the finance subcommittee or anything else, but you know, I will attempt to be there. But I'd like to have, if Beth, you and Peter are able to attend, or anybody else who wants to attend that meeting. Malin, I more than welcome you as well, having gone through quite a few budgets in your lifetime here. I would like to get the feedback there. While I believe some changes are there, I do know the statement is that everybody should stay in their lane. And I'm curious if somebody can define what they perceive our lane to be. Because at the end of the day, I don't think they truly understand at several of the boards. But they should be hearing more of that later, which we will discuss during budget.
Well, I think part of the problem, I watched the finance committee meeting where they discussed what changes they want to make. And there were there was a lot of discussion, which I think is valid, about the workload that was put on the school administration to answer questions. And it comes from us, and it comes from education, and it comes from Board of Finance, and it's like all these places, and it also is coming from the Board of Ed themselves. And I do agree, like, it's kind of gotten unwieldy that there's this, just because there's a budget season, it'd be like me, sending to the police department, well, I want to know this about regional dispatch and this about, and like to your point, Jack, that's not, I think it's gotten a little unwieldy. So I'm with them on that. But I heard just a lot of territorial, chest thumping also. Well, we need to see it first, and we're the Board of Ed, and so we need to look at it before anyone else looks at it. I mean, that's fine. I don't see the point, really. I mean, I
So,
just,
so
but they're
basically, that concept is we're going to make all the decisions, and you get it at the end, and we don't need you to do anything. And by the way, you don't have access to our administrators when you want to review the budget or raise certain things because the horse has already left the barn because that's our role. Well,
well,
then they will come to the point to understand that their budget will be cut, and that's our role. So
right.
people
And
have to
the
start to
other thing is,
understand there's things we can do.
they're doing too much in the budget season. And I think in my opinion, that's really what's the main problem. And maybe if they revise their calendar, they can fix this. But in a budget presentation, you shouldn't be saying we're adding these languages because we want to, we, yeah, we want to, sorry, someone's talking. We want to add these languages to our, foreign language department. I don't see why you do that just because it's budget season. Like the Board of Ed should be reviewing the foreign language departments routinely, or I don't, and I don't mean every month, but like, you should know, okay, we're going to do a review and figure out what we want to do with foreign languages. And like, to me, those should be rolled out before budget season. Like, this is where we're lacking. I don't know. That's just one example, but I just think they try to do it. Most things are, except for emergencies like SSOs, they're not rolled out during the year. They only new things you see are in budget season.
And I do want to add to that, because if you look at the comments that Beth Peter put together for what we presented back to the Board of Ed, we supported certain things like we shouldn't first be hearing of a project, which is what David Brown has been saying. Dave Brown has been saying frequently, we shouldn't first be hearing about this at budget. In reality, virtually everything should be resolved by the end of November, so that when it's coming in, it makes sense. That's number one. The things though that we did add, and I that some of these people haven't been around, but the whole recalculation of the excess cost reimbursement was something that I initiated when John Bolton was the chair of the Board of Ed. The concept of supporting the SBLI, or whatever that thing is called, I always get that wrong with Saving Bank Insurance. We went to the Board of Finance and said support that because it was worthwhile. Even hey, you have extra money you can pre-buy, but instead of how you pre-bought in the past, take it off your budget because it doesn't need to go into the general fund. So if you look at most of our questions, they were on policy and procedure, even with the fact of suggesting that they have a 3 to 5 year cost analysis of, if I am introducing this is what it's going to cost me for the next 3-5 years, instead of looking myopically at each one. Our other questions are simple, which quite honestly, some of them can be really reasonably answered during the one-day budget meeting. You don't have to write it down, I'm going to get back to you. If you have the answer, give it to us. I mean, and we can move on. I don't think we've really submitted a bunch of questions afterwards. We did our first thing. We had some questions. We weren't going in there and saying more. And we did have conversations with Duke, Adley, and Rich off the record where they were able to answer questions or issues without going and writing us an answer. I think there are too many questions asked. I don't think I'm not comfortable with that we're giving an initial view, which has a slew of questions, some of which I actually said to Rich jokingly, I'm reading some of these questions. Let me know if you want me to answer them and take some things off your plate, because some of these questions you should, or the people asking should already know the answers to. We shouldn't be going back and relitigating something from 2-3 years ago. That's not what the purpose of this is. We shouldn't ask minute things on policy and procedure. We don't challenge whether or not you should have 5 languages or 3. Not our purview. We stay out of that. So while I agree that there's too many questions, they should also be understanding where some of the questions are. And if you do want our comments very early on, it should only be on process, procedure, and whether or not their budget's too high, and not specific to any of the discussions on that. That should be part of the Board of Ed discussion. That being said, the 2-minute public comment is a bunch of hooey. So, from my own personal opinion, takes
Can I ask
me.
a question?
Sure.
Why is this year, why now, or is there a need to change the procedure? Is this been a year of exceptionally high number of questions?
No, it's been due for some time.
Okay.
All right. And the other thing
Been
that,
growing.
well, not that it's growing. The other thing that I will say is it's their budget, and hence they can do it anytime they want. And if we're questioning, well, why are you doing this now and other, it really doesn't matter why. That's part of the place where people are getting out of their lane to tell them what they can and can't do. And I'm not willing to do that. And I actually support conversations that I had with Duke even before John raised them, said, yeah, this didn't make sense. The meeting that we had, we presented on Tuesday, all right? And then we had a joint meeting with education, and we had Rich, Duke, and Adley there. And I thought that joint meeting was to review a union contract, and found out that education wanted to discuss the budget. And I thought that was totally outrageous. We presented some of our issues to them on Tuesday. Adley said we'd get them on Friday. Asking more questions or asking him to answer 3 days before he said he was going to is just rude. And then, quite honestly, the Board of Ed hadn't had an opportunity to opine on their own budget yet. So I thought that meeting was totally out of order. And Duke and Adley has known that I agreed with them. So anyway. Is there any other questions on that? But Malin, I agree, you're right. And everybody, no offense, everybody's getting to ask questions of them. And I think there are too many questions going on, some
Yep.
of which have no relationship to the budget.
Right.
Okay. Great Island discussion. I'm going to make some statements and then other people can add in, but I want to provide some information. At the rules meeting, there was a lot of discussion of what transpired, and for the public record, I want to make some corrections of what was said there first so that we can address some of that. I also want to express some other things which could have simply been answered but was not, and then provide that information. So, I'd asked Jim Palin about a 1.2 to 1.3 million already spent on Great Island. I was told that I was mistaken, that number wasn't the number that was there. And the real fact is, and I was told that only 300,000 had been spent on the due diligence and other things like that. Jim is wrong. On the document given by Jen to Jim and his committee, the number actually was 1,299,000, and it consisted of approximately 270,000 related to the due diligence and something that was in the contract, which we just first got, not the revised one, the new one. And that within like 14 days after or some time period after the RTM approved the purchase of it, per contract, the town was supposed to give 1% to the seller as a deposit for that contract, which was $1,030,000, equal to 1% of the original purchase price of $103 million. So what we were told in there was just inaccurate, and rather disappointed that that's what's going on. But we have spent that amount of money. So I want to make sure on the public record that, in fact, what I asked was correct. Number two, I also asked whether or not I thought that the Board of Finance had executive session. I've been out of commission a little bit over the last couple of days, and I was told no, there was no executive session. What was failed to happen to mention to us is on Monday, no, we have not had an executive session. But by the way, tomorrow, the Board of Finance is having the executive session you were alluding to, which started the meeting, and you heard Malin make comment on that. You know, it's really hard to question whether or not why people are questioning your transparency when you can't even add that we're having the executive session tomorrow. I mean, in all reality, it's not good teamwork. John Wolcott had stated that at the Board of Finance meeting that had the full 103 been used, they would have had to come back to the Board of Finance and the RTM for the 6.5, but I do want to get into that. Jim also made a comparison between Great Island's 18 million extra to HHR not stating state grant numbers that might be coming back. Peter answered that, but part of what I'm going to tell you is in our budget, we had a very defined area. We knew exactly what the contingencies were for each of those three schools. And also I stated for each of those bonding issues that we did not put in the state grants because it was unclear how to calculate it. I said what the ranges were, but even things like if we put 1,000 square feet into a classroom that they say we're only should be 900, the state's not reimbursing us any amount for that extra 100 feet, or if we make hallways wider than what the state regulations are. So we were very clear on what we weren't going, what we knew and what we didn't know when we voted for that. The other thing that I will say is I spoke to Jen, and my concern was whether or not there were going to be in the 115 million, whether or not that was just going to be long-term bonds, or whether or not some bans were also going to be issued. I have subsequently found out the answer to that, which is the Board of Finance chose option 2 that was granted to them. And as such, half of the Great Island purchase of 85 million will be put into a bond anticipation note. The 6.5 million will be put into a bond anticipation note. The difference between the purchase price and the 6.5 and the closing costs provides about $11 million. That is not being bonded in either long-term notes or the bond anticipation notes. There may be other things in the bond anticipation notes, not nearly necessary to go into that. I'll also add that, based upon the timeline and the fact that they need liquidity to move this forward, the fact is that when they completed the contract, they didn't have enough time to come to the RTM to potentially say we need 6.5 million in liquidity and have all that resolved and still make the 14-day deadline in that. So I do support the 6.5 for a variety of reasons and using that out of the 18 million simply because there wasn't enough time to meet the April 6th bonding deadline that had been set and also get the appropriate approvals from the RTM going forward. But I do believe that members of the Board of Finance have been very specific on not bonding the other $11 million. That's only my interpretation. And the reason why they're done in a bond anticipation note is that those will be due in a year. Part of the reason we're doing that is to not spike the debt service. And so we'll only pay interest on those, and then we'll go out to market, and with any luck, maybe the rates are lower. But also on the 6.5 million, that aspect that is not spent or encumbered is not rolled already automatically into a long-term bond and can be returned to the town. So that's some of my highlights of it. Peter, you were there as member of Rules. You can, like your perspective. And Jenny, you can also mention one of the changes that was done at the Board of Selectmen, because I've stated that some of the trusts by these people are not there as it once was based upon how they're handling this 18 million. You had every right to go and say, rescind this amount from it. They have not. And just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. I had a conversation with Wayne on one aspect that I'm not discussing here because we would need to go into executive session. The other thing is that there's a lot of things that people haven't realized that the that the RTM can, and if this behavior continues, will do. So, Peter, I'll let you go next.
Thanks. I appreciate it. And just to try to go into some of the details and keep this as simple as possible. I mean, in some ways, this has all been brought on by a good problem. It's a good thing. We were able to have the purchase price for the property in Great Island was reduced by $18 million. So we're all happy to have $18 million less to pay for the island and the property. What makes things problematic is that when we authorized the spending of $103 million for the purchase price, it was, and I think this is a fair statement, but it was assumed by all of us. And I go back to the June 2nd, 2022 memo from Kate Bush discussing the specifics of the transaction, that $103 million was going to go for the purchase. So we all assumed that $103 million is going to be used for the purchase. Nobody envisioned a lower purchase price by which authorized bonded funds, we would basically have some type of surplus of bonded funds, but that's what we ended up with. And this issue really came to a head at the May 21st Board of Finance meeting, when one member of the Board of Finance started discussing the $6.5 million that's been requested to be spent on certain issues with Great Island. And it was brought up that this funding had not been, the spending had not been discussed, and why there had been no details presented, and the statement by more than one member of the Board of Finance that there was no intent to have any monies left over from purchase to be spent on any additional improvements. To be intellectually fair and honest, Section 1 of Sentence 1 in the bonding resolution talks about improvements. The word improvement is in there, and we can discuss whether or not some of these issues come under that the scope of that language. However, I think it's fair, and I believe both several members of the Board of Finance said that really is no intent there to have money spent from that authorized bonding on anything other than the purchase. And again, John Walcott said if they had spent the full $103 million and any improvements were going to be done, we would have had we, referring to the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen, would have to come back to the RTM and seek additional funds. So it really comes down to is we have an unanticipated excess or surplus in this bonded funding, and the question is, how should that be handled? And there was a lot of debate at Rules about this, and I spent a lot of time discussing what I felt was the consensus of other RTM members. With Jack and I discussed this, which is that given that there was language in the bonding resolution that used the word improvements, there may be issues about the scope of that language, but frankly, it was an assumption that we all had. There was no discussion of a contingency for any surplus of bonded funds. There was no expectation that the price was going to go down. There was no intent, in the words of Dan Baumgartner, there was no intent that surplus would be a blank check for the Board of Selectmen or the Board of Finance. And I think that is in some ways the essence of the discussion. So the question still remains: how should this be done? And how should this be handled? And there have been, I think Jack has accurately summarized that there have been executive sessions for some of the details on the $6.5 million worth of spending. The RTM has not been included in it. We believe that the RTM should be included in these in some type of executive session discussions. Because again, it's money. These are funds that were not anticipated to be open for spending by the Board of Selectmen. Jim Palin discussed how there was surplus, that this is a liquidity issue, and that as with some of the other major construction contracts that were going on with both Ox Ridge, and the three elementary schools, that there was some surplus funding for liquidity that was included. I think those events are distinguishable because in those situations, those were planned. Here, this was basically almost an accident, a good accident. Again, we're happy that there's $18 million more. But in rules, we really didn't have a definitive sense of exactly what action we could take in this situation.
I don't want to get into the action at this stage.
I understand that, but
We'll discuss it at the appropriate time.
That's fine.
But there will be action.
Right. Well, one of the things I asked for at the rules meeting, and I believe I'm on the, had discussed this at an earlier discussion of Great Island here with the committee, that we frankly should all be read in on what these expenses are for the 6.5 in detail. Now, if that means having an executive session with this committee, then we should have it. Frankly, I expressed the opinion that when these bonded funds are going to be available, the first thing that the first selectman and the Board of Finance should have done was to actually come and have a discussion with us about it. And I believe in good faith that if we had had detailed understanding of where these monies were to be are to be spent, or where they may be spent, we would be happy, most likely, absent something extraneous, we'd be happy to support them. However, there are people, whether it be on our committee and elsewhere in the RTM, that are concerned about the situation, and that the RTM needs to have a say, or at least a briefing, a full understanding of the details of how this money is being spent and will be spent down the road. And I think it would be, to the extent that the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance are not discussing with us proactively ahead of time, any tension regarding this issue is really being caused by that. If we had been addressed and said, here, $6.5 million, it needs to be spent in the following areas, bullet pointed out in detail, we'd be happy as a clam, most likely to support it and approve it.
So I'm gonna budge in for a little bit. This is not about what they're spending the money on. This is about process and procedure. They were afforded some flexibility. They could just as easily rescinded that amount and then come back to the RTM for future things, other than the 6.5, because of the time crunch and the fact that we're only going out to the market once a year, and we had to make the April 6th deadline in order to make the May deadline for paying for this. The fact of the matter is that this should have been rescinded. We would have then supported the various other things that are going on, because most people are in support of moving it forward. But there are some things in there that are concerned. And even if I like what they're doing it on for the other 11 million, it's not the way to go. It's just not the way to go. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. But people should start reading the charter and the ordinances, because there's a heck of a lot of things that the RTM can do that they don't think we can. Matter of fact, I even heard something that the RTM actually may have subpoena powers. I don't know who we could possibly subpoena, but the RTM has a lot of powers that people are not recognizing. So we will eventually get there. But all I want to say is that the question is that even how I just explained the finances wasn't explained to rules properly, which would have resolved certain things. And, I don't care if they give explanations on I don't think that everybody knows what's going on. on with the other 11 million because they haven't decided. I've made the comment that I don't agree with the current committee structure. We were one time told that a conservatory would be created or would be inspected. And I actually think that the first thing that the committee should be doing is creating that organization and coming back to the Board of Selectmen and hire the appropriate people to be on there. And if we have to pay somebody who knows how to do these things on a is professionally on running these things, it's not a bad idea. This is a heck of an investment to go on. So I'll give it to Jen.
Jack, I wanted to make that point. Is I'm very worried about the governance of this, right? I mean, independent of the discussions about what are the rights of the RTM versus the Board of Finance versus, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. I mean, this is a highly complex thing. We saw, in the course of approving it, we had debates about how much of it is going to stay, environmentally pristine, how much of it's going to go for, equestrian facilities. Is it going to be a skating rink? Is there going to be a wedding? I mean, what I'm saying? Like all these debates about how the property is actually going to get used. I mean, that's going to be a process that we have to go through over a period of time. And I think, and the concern that I have is it's going to end up being, not management by committee, but management by multiple committees part-time. And I think it could end up being a car crash.
Yeah, or as somebody once
this debate about was it 103.85 and what's going to happen to the other 18 and who's going to spend. I mean, and I think this is just going to be the first of 28 discussions like this that we're going to have over the next 3 years if we don't put some kind of proper governance in place. And that like we have a superintendent of schools. I almost feel like we're going to need a superintendent of Great Island who's on point to control all these details. Yeah.
Well, I think that's what Jack is referring to by conservancy. Conservancy.
Good.
So
Well, I also want to make, Jenny, I also want to make one little similar thing that I one time read when I was much younger, that the chief of staff said he asked the generals that were sitting around the table if they could define what a camel is. And nobody could come up with his definition. And he finally said a camel is a horse designed by committee. So we want a horse here. We don't want a camel. So I'm fully support what you just said, Charles. Jenny, I'm sorry we cut you off so many times. Go to it.
That's okay. I attended the Board of Selectmen meeting on Monday night at the same time the Rules Committee was getting going. So one of the things I was there to speak about was the formation of the initial Building Advisory Committee. And Lois Schneider and Rolf Orban were also there to speak. Lois raised the issue of making sure that as expenditures move forward on Great Island, that there's language that get modified to include that the any future expenditures, and I believe that's alluding to all the authorized but unissued debt or bonds that were being contemplated for Great Island, that be approved by Board of Selectmen, Board of Finance, and the RTM. So the Board of Selectmen did not take action on that at the time, but the other thing that came up was this initial building advisory composition, and I spoke about rethinking the construct of it, because it calls for 2 Board of Selectmen members, the chairman of the Board of Finance, chairman of Planning and Zoning, chairman of Parks and Rec Commission, and then 2 members from the public. And then the moderator or summon the moderator for the RTM appoints. And I raised the issue to be short. It's like, well, most of you already have decision-making authority or ownership. The selectmen pretty much are in control of this property. Board of Finance chair is going to have direct impact, direct feedback certainly the planning and zone, anything that happens on Grand Island has to be done in conjunction with P&Z. So I made the comment, consider opening up more spots for the public, because you don't want to appear that you're advising yourselves. And Rolf Orban, said the same thing. Sarah Newman raised the issue, saying, I think we need more members of the public. Ultimately, they did make a motion to amend that committee to, while Jeremy Ginsburg is going to be an ex officio member, so they're going to have that advice anyway, that they're adding one more member from the public, and that the initial building committee is, Monica gave a little more color on what that really means, which gave me a little more peace of mind, which was this was a committee to design, I believe to set up the system to appoint members down the road. It's a 1-year committee, so these members are going to change, but it's really to oversee this first, I personally, I think they should call it the pre-phase, which is how to get people on the island. And if you haven't seen the Board of Selectmen meeting, go back and watch it, because she and John Zagrodzky and all the other members of the Board of Selectmen did say, when the video was sent around and people saw, when you see the video of the island, that's one thing, but until you walk on it, you really can't even begin to think about the next phase. But the issue is access. So the $6.5 million it's bonded. We're in the market. It's the liquidity piece to be able to allow flexibility to get them on the island. But I think there is a question still outstanding of, I don't think they really know what this initial advisory committee clearly will do. They're going to go to work on it. They're going to go to work on the scope of it. They laid out some initial scope, but I hear you, Jack, that it's a deviation of what was the original rhetoric.
It was a deviation from what would be a little more specific. It's a complete deviation of what we were told when we were told how this transaction was going to occur.
So recognizing that this process is no one's ever done this before. This is a really historic point. This acquisition's it's a historic acquisition for Darien. It's a really big deal, and the magnitude of it it's huge. So I am willing to allow some level of flexibility and fluidity, but the communication has to get better. It just has to get better, because we got to learn to stay in front of the runaway when there's no communication, and we're left for 8 months knowing, like, okay, we signed a contract. 8 months later, okay, it's $85 million, and then there's kind of a surprise of, and there's $6 million to get it ready. All of a sudden, it raises issues. So as long as
Jenny,
I hope the Board of Selectmen and the Board of Finance keep us in the loop.
I don't care about them keeping us in the loop. That's a Pollyanna approach.
Call me Pollyanna.
Wait. Let me say, this is $103 million investment. We do not have time to have people make mistakes, even to the simplest part. That my understanding of the 6.5 million is to put together 3 parking lots. Well, once you put that improvement in, it's there. Once you put that improvement in, you have already preset certain aspects to it. So I think that if you're going to really make the right choice, and I understand we may have some expenses in remediation, other things like that, which is why I'm not opposed to having some liquidity for them to do roads and a couple of other things that are there to get this thing moving. All right. I don't think that access is the most important part. I think that the most important part here is determining what our governance will be, and then let the people who are being selected for that governance move forward in an orchestrated method. anyone who says that we need to have this done in 1 year or 2 years, I'm telling you, it's going to be a mistake. And so, because I come from a more conservative planning perspective, putting this in for, oh, this is just our initial seed money, 6.5 million buys a heck of a lot of stuff. And we may be, because we have approved it and we understand the timing on it, and I'm not against the 6.5, but damn it, at the end of the year, there's no guarantee that we're going to be any closer to having a governance there. And 2 years down the road, we're not going to be any closer. And quite honestly, if you told us you're going to be investigating a governance, and during all this negotiation, you've done bupkis, people have lost credibility that they're ever going there. And so that's why I say it's Pollyanna. I judge people on what they say and then what they do. And what they've said and what they've done is not been the same.
Right.
That's
and
just
this
my
initial,
point.
the initial building committee, building advisory committee, from what I heard was that it's setting up the system for how the rest of it's good. It's step one. And I agree with you. It's not
I didn't
been,
see conservatory being listed any place on that charter.
and by the way, nor should it. We're not there yet, Jack.
Yeah, but we should, but then it doesn't take a big thing is to determine number one on that project should be determine governance. So if we're not going to a conservatory, let them evaluate it. But just to have nothing there on that says they ain't addressing it. They're going to be very comfortable making decisions for what goes on. And yet, even though those meetings are open and other things like that, they have $11 million to spend. And quite honestly, under the definition, which I said, in our last meeting, when I said the purchase price is still 103, I could have said the purchase price is 85, but the acquisition cost is still 103. And I think I found a nuance to where it's not for that. But that's a whole other area that I'll take offline. But the fact of the matter is the fact that review governance isn't part of that charter doesn't make it.
Nor is how they're going to select, like how they're going to select members from the public. They don't, the 3 members from it's not known yet.
I thought it was 4 at this time, not 3.
I think it's 3. It had been 2, got moved to 3. And then Seth, the RTM moderator, can be the rep or appoint somebody. So there's no system in place for that yet. So that is the next step that has to,
right. But that's why,
how do you even determine how to fill those spots? There has to be a system established.
But that's why I don't have the same comfort level upon hearing that. It gives me no more comfort. It actually makes me more concerned.
I think the first test of good governance is, if necessary, an executive session that the Board of Selectmen give us full details on the spending of the 6.5, what their intent may be for other spending, and frankly, a pledge, a written agreement that no money be spent outside of the 11.5 that has not been bonded. If that is bonded in the future, all those monies are going to be run through the normal process, the normal appropriation process,
which we would support and move through.
Right, so exactly. Listen, give credit. This is what Lois Schneider said at Rules Committee, and I think it was a great idea. That would, I think, assuage the many people that are very concerned about how this is evolving. We would like to have this evolve with good governance, so that we avoid having issues of miscommunication or non-communication and questioning people's intent, et cetera, et cetera. Because in the absence of facts, pardon?
100%.
Yeah, in the absence of facts, negative inferences begin to flourish. And again, I'll go back to, I have to repeat this, but once the price changed and the authorization for $13 million of this, I call it unanticipated budget surplus, there should have been conversations on the Board of Finance and the Board of Selectmen with the RTM, with this committee, if necessary, in executive session. And I hope they still happen. I'd love to have them happen as soon as possible. That would be a great step forward in the right direction.
All right. So with that, I want to shut down this conversation. I want to hand it over to Jenny so we can do minutes. All yours, Jenny.
Any questions on the minutes? Any comments, typos that I have to fix? All good. May I have a motion to approve the minutes from the March 20, yikes, what was it? Okay. Charles and Bert.
Okay.
All in, yeah, can we?
All in favor?
All in favor? Gotcha. Thank you,
Okay.
everybody.
And you
So
have, and you have to put Go Huskies on there. Do you see?
Yes.
Yay!
No,
I was at Two Roads at the game party.
Oh, fun! Well, that's fun.
I have to admit that, you know, all the people are finally realizing that in the last 25 years, no other college in the United States on the men's side has won 5 tournaments, and people who are not considering UConn to be a blue blood is, you know, now equal with Duke and Indiana, and one behind North Carolina. And by the way, the 11 for UCLA, because I'm old enough to remember, you never used to go out of your region in the earlier NCAA tournaments, and the West was very weak. And UCLA, although they had phenomenal teams without question, some of the Hall of Famers they had playing for them, had a very weak Western group to make it to the Final Four every year. That being said, before I ask for an adjournment, this is a very interesting and exciting time of the year. So I'd like to wish anyone who's celebrating Ramadan, Passover, or Easter a very happy time and healthy year. With that, I'll take, yep. And if I left somebody out from a religious background, my apologies. So now I'll take a motion to adjourn. I have Barry moving. I have Louisa seconding. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Great meeting, folks. Thank you so much. I can stop recording.